Hello students, this is Dr. Barry Graham, your instructor for Humanities 231 and 232. You'll recall from our lecture last time, lecture 1, that we began a series on escape from reason, the dilemma of 21st century culture. I'm taking a stand here that modern culture embraces irrationality. That's my thesis, just like you'll be writing a term paper with a thesis statement in this class. And I want to acknowledge that much of this material is borrowed from Dr. R.C. Sproul, as well as a number of great thinkers that I mentioned last time, so I won't bother to go into that again, but just do want you to know that I've been the beneficiary of many good teachers over the course of my life. I don't want to engage in plagiarism without crediting, so I do want to credit each one of them. So we'll start the PowerPoint presentation as we speak, and as we do, we'll be going into lecture 2 of our Escape from Reason series here. Just by way of review, you'll note that we are talking about some powerful tools that will be very advantageous for you to have. They're the laws of logic. You'll recall that there's the law of non-contradiction, the law of causality, sometimes referred to as the law of cause and effect, the basic reliability of sense perception, and finally the analogical use of language. And today we'll be looking more in depth at the law of non-contradiction. For a more comprehensive review of lecture 1, of course you can go back and review the entirety of lecture 1. The law of non-contradiction basically states that A cannot be non-A. We'll look at that in just a second, but we want to remember that logic itself has no content. It simply measures the relationship between ideas or premises. Then and only then can we determine whether our conclusions are true. So this is very important because we'd all like to think that what we believe is true, or that we're coming to some true ideas and conclusions on things. But remember, as we mentioned last time, proof has rules. And so by learning these laws of logic, we're going to assemble some very valuable tools that will help us to build our case for to provide evidence for that. Remember that the relationship between ideas and premises is very important, because things really exist in relationship to other things. I mentioned earlier that the law of non-contradiction states that A cannot be non-A. Now you may be thinking, well, what's A? It's useful in these kinds of laws of logic where we construct and show how they work, that we use symbols to represent what we're talking about, because then we can insert in different things to show that we can make a case for it. In other words, let's say instead of A, we just insert a pen, a writing pen. Instead of A cannot be non-A, I take a writing pen out of my pocket and I show it to all of you, and I say, this pen cannot be a non-pen. In other words, this pen cannot be not a pen. In other words, it's either a pen or it's not a pen. And while that may seem kind of commonsensical, it's amazing how even very smart people have drifted into some irrationality where they've forgotten how the law of non-contradiction works. Now we need to put some qualifiers on this. A cannot be non-A at the same time and in the same relationship. So that's very important. For instance, I could say I could be both a father and a son at the same time. But could I be both a father and a son in the same relationship? Well, I think you know the answer is no there. Back a few years ago when my mother was alive, I could be both a son to her, but yet at the same time a father to my grown children. But I couldn't be that in the same relationship. I have a son, Stephen. I can't be both his father and his son at the same time in that relationship. So we want to qualify these things in this way. A good example that we can use to illustrate the law of non-contradiction is what's called a syllogism. Now, you may or may not be familiar with syllogisms, a syllogism. So I'm going to really encourage you guys to jump online and Google syllogism. There's a wealth of helpful information out there because in a course like this, we don't have time to get into it as in depth as what might ultimately be the most helpful for you. So we're going to ask you to take advantage of those internet sites out there, and I'm going to post a few of those in your internet resources that are available on your Schoology page, but you can also Google. But let's look at this. A syllogism has three parts: a primary premise, a secondary premise, and finally a conclusion. And the interesting thing about a syllogism is that what we state here in the primary premise, if it's true, and what we state in the secondary premise is true, and we've constructed this syllogism in the way that it's supposed to be constructed, we can't help but come to a true conclusion. If this is true, and this is true, and we've constructed it right, this will have to be true. Going to show you a quick example of that. For instance, let's say we have a syllogism where our primary premise is all crows are black. Our secondary premise is Jack is a crow. Our conclusion will be, therefore, Jack is, and how would you fill in the blank? Well, once again, let's review, let's look at it. If all crows are black and Jack is a crow, therefore Jack is black. It has to be true. Now notice the reason it has to be true is because our conclusion includes parts of both of our premises. All right? Crows up here is a part of a large group that's black. Jack is a part of this large group. All right? So whatever's true of the large group is true of the smaller part of that group. So if all crows are black and Jack is a crow, Jack has to be black. In other words, we really don't find out anything in the conclusion that wasn't already there inherently in the premises. But we have come to an absolutely true conclusion here, and we know it 100% if the syllogism is set up correctly. And in this case it was, because the syllogism, the conclusion, has parts of both of the premises. Notice right here, Jack is here in the secondary premise. Black, which would be right here, is here in the primary premise. Now, this is important because you have many people in our culture that say, well, you know, truth is relative. You have your truth and I have my truth, but who's to say what's really true? Well, in this case, we can say, well, this is absolutely true. Assuming that we have some evidence that this is true, and assuming we have some evidence that this is true, the conclusion has to be true. Absolutely 100%. It's not relative at all. Jack absolutely has to be black, assuming the truth of these. So if your premise is set up correctly, you can come to an absolutely true conclusion. And by the way, this is called deductive reasoning. There's at least three different types of reasoning: inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, as we've talked about here. Abductive reasoning falls into a different category. We won't talk about that in this class, but this is deductive reasoning. Now notice also that I used the term valid, I believe, earlier there. What we looked at in terms of the crow syllogism, it was an absolutely valid syllogism, all right, because it had parts of two things that showed up in the conclusion. So I say this because many times people think of something being valid and something being true as the same thing. Now, that's a perfectly appropriate use of those terms many times, but when we're talking about syllogisms, we don't want to mix those up. Validity, or whether something is valid, is different from whether it's true when we're talking about logic and syllogisms. Notice a syllogism is valid when its conclusion follows from its premises. And so that makes for some interesting examination of these syllogisms. For instance, do the premises have to be true in order for it to be a valid syllogism? Well, the answer actually is no here. We could have two syllogisms that are two premises rather, that are absolutely false, but it could still be valid as long as the conclusion flows from those premises. I'll give you an example. Let's say I were to make a statement like this: all people from Arkansas are stupid. John is from Arkansas, therefore John is stupid. Now that's an absolutely valid syllogism, but it's not true. At least one of my premises there was false, and you can probably guess which one, especially if you're from Arkansas. And I'm not picking on people from Arkansas. I'm just choosing that randomly. It's not true that all people from Arkansas are stupid. However, if it were true, and John was from Arkansas, it would have to be absolutely 100% true that John would be stupid. So it's valid the way we pick the way that we constructed it, but it's not true. And if that doesn't make sense, you can again Google valid syllogism, put in some keywords, and I'm sure you can get some additional information on that as well. Here's another interesting thing we can ask. If one or both of the premises are false, will the conclusion be false? Well, again, the interesting thing is not necessarily. Let's say, for an example, here's my primary premise. All fish live in the sea. My secondary premise is dolphins are fish. And then my conclusion would be dolphins live in the sea. Well, hey, my conclusion's true. However, were my premises true? No. The secondary premise there, dolphins are fish, is false because, as you know, dolphins are actually mammals. They just happen to be mammals that live in the sea. So I really came to a true conclusion by just dumb luck. It was just an accident. It is true that dolphins live in the sea, but it has nothing to do with the idea that they would be fish, because they're not fish. It just so happens that both fish and dolphins live in the sea. However, one thing that we do know that absolutely is true is this last sentence, the answer to this last sentence. If both premises are true, will the conclusion be true? And the answer is absolutely 100% yes. Again, assuming that the syllogism is set up correctly or the syllogism is valid. Again, go back to the crow example. Both of the premises were true. All crows are black. Second premise, we've got a crow named Jack. Jack is a crow, so that's true. We've named him Jack, okay? So if it's true that all crows are black, and if it's true that Jack is a crow, it's absolutely 100% must be true that Jack is black. Now, by ignoring the law of non-contradiction, how we come to know things, epistemology, there's one of our big words again, it can absolutely become irrational, and it can even happen with very, very otherwise intelligent, smart people. Notice Niels Bohr, one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists that the world's ever seen. Notice what he said. A great truth is a truth of which the contrary is also a truth. Well, again, sorry, Dr. Bohr, you may be, and you are, a brilliant person, but that's not true. Okay? If something is true, the contrary or the opposite of it cannot possibly be true. This is also what's known as a self-refuting or a self-defeating statement. Because if it's true that a great truth is a truth of which the contrary is also a truth, so if the contrary of that is true, then we would have to also say a great truth is a truth of which the contrary is also false. So again, it's like cutting off the branch that you're sitting on. It defeats itself. Another brilliant person, the great theologian Karl Barth, who personally I have a lot of respect for. I think he was a brilliant individual, but he messed up here. Contradictions are the hallmark of truth. Well, sorry, Dr. Barth, you're mistaken there. If two things contradict, they both cannot be true. So if we're really honest, we would react like one of these characters in the Star Trek episode that we've actually made a discussion assignment on your Schoology site here. We call it Liar's Paradox. It's just a little short video clip from an episode of the classic Star Trek series. We want you to view that, and I'll be assigning that and putting a due date on it, and you'll have another chance to have an interesting online discussion with each other. Star Trek was way ahead of its time. Brilliant series. So we'll want you to look at that, and so be watching for that on the Schoology website. Liar's Paradox. Here's a Latin phrase that fits into this subject matter today. Ex nihilo nihil fit. It's Latin for out of nothing, nothing comes. Another way to say this would be something cannot come from nothing. Now, you may be looking at that and saying, well, yeah, that's certainly true, because you've got something here that should just be common sense. But apparently common sense is not so common anymore, because once again, you've got some brilliant people out there that believe everything came from nothing. The universe came from nothing. There's a brilliant physicist by the name of Lawrence Krauss. You can Google him as well. And he wrote a book recently called A Universe from Nothing. And again, brilliant individual, but how can something come from nothing? It's just not possible. Unless you're going to hold that the universe is an illusion, and I don't think most of us hold that. There has to be something that's real. So even if the universe that we're perceiving is something in the way of an illusion, I don't believe that it is, but there would have to be something called reality or the universe that would be real. Some people hold that, well, perhaps the answer is that the universe is self-created. Look at a statement here by another brilliant individual. The universe might as well have been self-created in an atheistic manner. In other words, you didn't need God. Maybe the universe just created itself. But what we want to remember is the law of non-contradiction shows us that the term self-creation is itself a contradiction. It just doesn't make any sense. Think about it. If you created yourself, let's just forget about the universe for a second. Let's just talk about one person. You created yourself. In order for you to be able to create yourself, you would have had to have existed before you existed. And so that's a contradiction. How can you exist before you existed? So what we're learning here is that the reason why these kinds of statements are nonsense is because it's the law of non-contradiction that defines the limit of intelligible speech. In other words, intelligible meaning sensible. If it's unintelligible, it's nonsense. words have to be constructed and statements have to be constructed with words in such a way that the words make sense when used together in the proper relationship with each other, like we mentioned earlier. For instance, if I were to come up to you and ask you, excuse me, but may I mambo dog face to the banana patch? You'd look at me rightly like I had two heads or something. You know, those words all mean something, or they make sense in isolation or when used properly. Certainly mambo means something. It's a type of dance. Dog face certainly means the face of a dog. Banana patch is a place, yeah. But to say, may I mambo dog face to the banana patch, just makes no sense. I haven't put the words together in a way that makes for intelligible speech. Now, many scientists, again, talking about smart people, scientists, have drifted into irrationality by speaking in contradictions. For instance, look at this phrase by Robert M. Sapolsky. Again, has to be smart. He's a professor at a great university, Stanford University, one of the most renowned universities in the world. But look at his quotation here. I might even continue to believe that there is no God, even if it was proven that there is one. But it's clear to me I don't need to believe that there is a God in order to berate him or to make fun of God. Now, again, look at what this otherwise brilliant person is saying. I wouldn't believe in God even if you proved that he exists, or he, she, it, whatever tag you want to put on God there. He said, proof doesn't matter. I've chosen to believe this particular way, and nothing's going to change my mind. All right. In fact, even if God does exist or doesn't exist, that still doesn't stop me from making fun of him. So this is definitely an individual here who's just not speaking in ways that make sense, even though he's otherwise very, very brilliant, smart person. Now, as we can see, what's going on here, this is an act of desperation to justify the unjustifiable. Even smart people can do this, right? It's analytically false. We're going to talk about analogical truths in one of our future lectures. So hang on to that. But what Mr. Sapolsky said earlier was analytically, not analogically, but rather, I'm sorry about that, analytically false. All right? And it reminds me of this quotation from the great Greek philosopher Aristotle. In the minds of the brightest men often resides the corner of a fool. Well, even smart people can be foolish. And that's what we're seeing examples of as we examine this material. So once again, thank you for joining me for Lecture 2, and we will see you next time on Lecture 3.